I'm going to go ahead and get started with my lesson here. I'm getting over a bit of a cold. And so if I cough or pause or something, that's why. But my lesson is called Walking with God in the Desert. And it's kind of a recap of what I learned in 2021. It is kind of based around a book that I read this last year called Walking with God in the Desert, which if we talked like more than once last year, I probably mentioned it to you, especially if it was in the summertime, because that book really has impacted me a lot. So, and I spent most of last year reading through the Torah. So I spent a lot of time thinking about these desert analogies, and I'm grateful for Canva and their cute little deserts PowerPoint slides that they pre-made for me here, and just wanted to share kind of some of those lessons that I learned. So a little bit about me, if you don't know me. First of all, I just wanted to thank Cheryl for asking me to share. Definitely felt a little intimidated preparing this lesson for a few different reasons, and partially just because you guys are amazing and have done some incredible lessons this last year. I'm so grateful for these webinars. But if you don't know me, my name is Madison Hungerford. I'm 26 and married to Joey, and we have a daughter, Saoirse, and she's almost 2. And I'm due with another baby that we don't know what their gender is, but due in May. I lead the women's ministry part-time in Bend, which is, in my opinion, like one of the most beautiful cities in the world. I love hiking. I love traveling. The picture where I'm sitting down in front of this Sulphur Lake thing, that's the Tongariro Alpine Crossing Trek in New Zealand, also known as Mount Doom, if you love Lord of the Rings like I do. We got to do that trek a couple years back. And so I love traveling. I also love sewing, just got into quilting, and love crocheting and reading. I also really like filming YouTube videos and just hanging out, kind of lounging in coffee shops, mooching off people's Wi-Fi for free. I love just spending a few hours in the Bible at a cute coffee shop wherever I can. Doesn't happen often now, but love those times. I grew up in a very small town outside of Eugene, Oregon, has no stoplights and has like less than 2,000 people. Very small town on a big 65-acre ranch where my brother, my parents, and my grandparents actually all still live and are all baptized disciples, which is so incredible. They're in the church that Daniel and Stacy now lead over in Eugene. At different times throughout my life, I have attended the ICOC, where my parents were converted in San Diego in the early 90s. I've been a part of a mainline Church of Christ. I've been a part of the International Christian Churches, which is a long story. And I'm now back in the International Churches of Christ, which I'm so grateful for. And it's been very much of God for the last 5.5 or so years we've been here. I mentioned I've spent all of last year just reading Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So I've spent a lot of time really being kind of influenced by these desert scenes and imagery from the Bible. And I just kind of wanted to share some of the lessons that I feel like God taught me last year, because last year was very much a spiritual desert for me. So I want to start with reading Deuteronomy chapter 11, and it's kind of some snippets of verses 1-7. It says, "You shall therefore love the Lord your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always. And consider today the discipline or instruction of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his outstretched arm, his signs and his deeds, and what he did to you in the wilderness until you came to this place. For your eyes have seen all the great work of the Lord that he did." So kind of just want to focus on that word consider. Consider today what God did in the wilderness, in my life, in the Israelites' lives. Now, I want to share a little bit about some of my deserts, and want to just encourage us all to take a moment before I do and think about what some of those desert seasons of your life have been. Whether you've been a Christian for a year or 40 years, you've probably had at least one, if not many, deserts in your life, and spiritual deserts. So I just want us to kind of take a moment and consider what those things were, what God really did in those times. For me, some of my desert seasons were my freshman year of college when I almost walked away from God for a lot of reasons. There's always a boy mixed in there for some reason, but freshman year of college, almost walked away from God. That was a really low point in my walk. The year that we left our former fellowship, the ICC, we lost most of our friendships. That was a big desert for us. Lost most of our wedding party. We were engaged, long story, but that was a very, very difficult season. When we first moved to Bend, about 2 weeks after we got here, I ended up having a miscarriage. And that was really heart-wrenching. And I felt very alone. And it was so challenging because I was trying to be welcoming, welcome all these people who were moving in, and was going through something very devastating. After my daughter was born, developing postpartum anxiety and dealing with undiagnosed panic attacks and generalized anxiety for about a year and a half. Deep desert. The middle half of 2021, Joey and I dealt with some deep criticism and emotional strife from many members of our church from the Portland fallout kind of situation. Both publicly and locally here in our church. That was really, really hard. I'm going to share about that more. But each of those seasons have really broken me. They've brought me to my knees, and I would never want to repeat them, but I also would never want to forget them or the lessons that God taught me in those times. And it was honestly hard to write this lesson. I knew that's what I needed to write about, but I didn't want to go back there into those desert seasons mentally and reflect on them. I just, I want to move forward. I want to let go, but I know God did such powerful things. And so it was really good for my heart to go back, but it was, it was some self-denial to think back on these seasons. So I have kind of three main points that I want to go over with us today and talk about, which are, my theme is deserts, where God teaches his people some of the most profound lessons of our lives. The first point is that deserts teach us to depend on God. My second point is that deserts teach us to walk like Jesus. And my third point is that deserts keep our hearts soft and they keep us from becoming complacent. So I'm going to start with my first point. Deserts teach us to depend on God. I'm going to go ahead and read Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 10 through 13 here. Then I'll come back to that slide. It says, in verse 10, he found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness, he encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions, the Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the high places of the land, and he ate the produce of the field. And he suckled him with honey out of the rock, and oil out of the flinty rock. Going back to that previous slide here, humans really just need a few basic things for survival: food, water, air, and shelter. And I think that deserts, physical deserts, they remind us of our human frailty. They test all of those things: food, water, air, shelter. Deserts, they test those things, where if we have them or not, where they're coming from. It's where we learn that God is enough, and we can trust him to provide us with enough for each day. Spiritual deserts, they remind us that self-reliance is foolishness. It is foolishness. I became very aware of this year. that I could do nothing to control the people around me. I spent a lot of days, the only thing I could control was who I turned to for help. And I remember spending a lot of days just sitting in my backyard. It's beautiful summertime, watching my daughter play, but inside feeling like I was in this mental boxing match, like in turmoil in my mind, a deep wrestle. I felt this overwhelming list of the critical words of other people just ringing in my ears, repeating over and over in my mind, really weeping over my greatest fears becoming a possible reality. Fears like being fired from leading the church here in Bend with Joey, many members in our small church leaving and creating kind of a faction, fears of people hating me and publicly criticizing me, fears that the stress of all this would cause me to have a second miscarriage, fears of failing, fears of having to move somewhere that I didn't want to live, fear of pain, and just in my gut wanting to run away from everything. I wanted to run. I hate discomfort by nature. I don't think any of us love it, but everything in my body physically was like, run. I wrestled with God this year like I never have before. Spent a lot of time just outside pulling weeds in my backyard because it was a really monotonous task that if you pull weeds much or if you have a yard, can feel kind of pointless the next week when you look out your window and they're all back in abundance. You're like, oh, what a waste of time, but it's not. But my heart really needed that to just sit and wrestle and do something over and over again and be deep in thought with God, really work through my mind. I realized how much I needed God to hear my prayers and to turn this mess of a situation into a miracle. And it really, I had begged him daily to please show me his presence because I realized I need him. I cannot get through this season on my own. And it created such an intimacy in my relationship with God that I had never known before. A dependence that challenged my pride so much, and it brought me to my knees before him, knowing that I needed him desperately every single day. I've on my slide it says I've never felt closer to God than on the days that I realized I could not get through the day without his presence. I felt that before, but it felt so strongly that I have to see you today, God, or I don't know if I'm going to make it. This is awful, what I'm going through in my mind. And I just love this verse so much. It was in the desert. It says that God found Jacob. It wasn't on a mountaintop. It's where he cared for him, where he guided him. It's where Jacob wrestled with God and really learned to rely on him. God is often described as both a rock in the word, as well as him tasting as sweet as honey. And so this verse in verse 13, when it says he suckled him with honey out of the rock, stood out to me. Because I recently learned that there's an old saying that says, be careful when you go looking for honey because you might find it in a rock. I think that tasting the goodness of the Lord oftentimes starts with stumbling through rocky terrains and falling on our knees before him. I believe that every single one of us on this call who's, in ministry, in any kind of leadership here, especially in the Northwest, that we are determined to grow closer with God every day, that we want to know him and we want to make him known to the world. And oftentimes that requires that kind of intimacy. To know God that deeply requires that we walk through these spiritual deserts and really fall on our knees before him before we can really taste his goodness like honey. My second point is that deserts teach us to walk like Jesus. I'm going to read Isaiah chapter 32. And the whole chapter is great. I'd really encourage you to read it, but I'm just going to focus on verses 1 and 2 in this point. It says, "Behold, a king will reign in righteousness, and princes will rule in justice. Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land." I love this so much. We think about how a king will reign in righteousness, and princes are anyone who's under the rule of a king. That's all of us. God calls us his holy nation, a royal priesthood, princes. That I believe he's talking about a call for us to rule in justice, to be a hiding place from the wind and a shelter from the storm to the hurting people around us. Allie talked about water in her lesson before, which I loved. And I think it's really something to reflect on. What does it mean to be a stream of water in a dry place? We learn that by watching how Jesus learned that from God and saw God as this, great rock in a weary land, a shelter from the storm, that we can also be that for others. Deserts teach us to walk like Jesus. We know that we have to learn to be led and to lead others through this time, and that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert almost immediately after baptism. He was tempted and he learned obedience through all that he suffered. So if he went through it, if he went through spiritual deserts, I have to expect that I will as well. He learned to rely on God's shelter and to become a shelter from the storm to others along the way in his life as well. We often say that the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. We say that a lot. I've said that a lot. But oftentimes the passages that talk about them wandering are from their own perspective of feeling lost in the desert. We read a lot more about how God led them and guided them in the desert by fire at night and cloud by day. He intentionally led them every single step of the way, those 40 years in the desert. And he's still intentionally leading me and you today, even in our spiritual deserts. It doesn't mean that God's not leading us. It doesn't mean that he's abandoned us when we're going through deserts, although it can feel like that, especially when we're wrestling with relying on ourselves instead of on him. I think it means he's teaching us something important and believes that through our deserts, I can learn to walk in his ways and become more like Jesus. I mentioned I love hiking. I love hiking with my husband because he's always so prepared with directions. He knows where we're going, how to get there, how long it's going to take, everything. He does a lot of research beforehand to know what the weather is going to be, what our water sources are, everything. And I'm a little bit more of a show up and see where he takes me kind of hiker. And the reason I'm like that, though, is because I can trust that he'll lead me. I trust he's prepared and that he knows the way. And as long as I follow his direction, he's going to lead me to safety. And yes, if you're a hiker, you're probably going, you should probably get some direction yourself, Maddie. And I should know a little bit more about where I'm going before I go hiking in case of emergencies. But the point is that I always feel safe when I'm hiking with my husband because I trust his direction and I trust his heart to take care of me. I know I can rely on him. And that's the difference in walking with God. Instead of hiking on our own, walking on our own. I never go hiking by myself because I don't prepare ahead of time. And I know that it just probably wouldn't end well. So I don't really do it very often. But that's the difference in walking with God versus trying to do it on our own, is being led by someone we trust versus doing it on our own without guidance. And Jesus, even though he was God himself, he still was led by God's guidance. The deserts, they're where we learn to lead others too. There's this old Bedouin phrase that says, "You keep a clear path for the next generation by walking on it." And I read that and I wanted to share that because I think it's really powerful. It gave me this imagery of, I like I said, I grew up on a ranch and we would take our quads out and we would make new trails all the time in the forest. And it was just something for fun that we did was like chopping down trees and moving brush. And we didn't have a lot else going on at the time. We were homeschooled, but it was great. We used to do that all the time when we were kids. We did horseback and things like that. But if you don't use those trails, you'll lose them. I think back on those trails and I go, yeah, I doubt anybody's walking on those trails. They probably are very overgrown. I'm sure if anybody did walk down the main trail, they wouldn't even notice they were there because I doubt anybody's using those trails anymore. They were a little janky anyways. They'd probably be pretty impossible to find because no one's walking on them. And I think if and how you persevere during spiritual deserts of your life, it's an example to those around you in your life. And I want to share Jeremiah 6:16. It says, "This is what the Lord says: Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." We know that Jesus is the way. He says in Matthew 11, he talks about how, cast our burdens on him and we will find rest for our souls. And I wanted to share that because I just want to encourage my older sisters in the faith to remain steadfast on those ancient paths, that the paths that you walk, you're keeping those for our generation by walking on them. And it's so important. And I'm so grateful for the many amazing women of God that have been examples to me in my life who've walked those ancient paths. I'm forever grateful to them that they have held fast to the word of God every single day. And so I just want to encourage you to remain steadfast on those ancient paths. And for my younger sisters, my peers, like, those ancient paths, it doesn't mean that they're dusty or outdated because they're ancient. They're the good way. They're God's path. And I think the concept of really imitating our older sisters, if you disciple women, that concept is kind of fleeting from our generation. And I really want to encourage us and really challenge us to imitate our older sisters in their walks with Jesus, how they cling to the ancient path, and to urge the young women that we disciple to do the same. It's invaluable. It's invaluable. And I think the really hope that we have is in Jesus, that he is that good way. Romans 5 says that we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, which produces character, which produces hope. We can rejoice in our sufferings in the deserts because we have hope in Jesus. That as he showed us how to walk God's path, we can do it too. It produces hope for us, for our children, and for all of our hearers, all the women around us. My third point is that deserts keep our hearts soft and they keep us from becoming complacent. So I'm going to go ahead and read the second part of Isaiah 32. And it's a little fiery. I'm not going to lie. Isaiah 32, verse 9. The title is Complacent Women Warned of Disaster. This is directed at women, so it stood out to me. It says in verse 9, "Rise up, you women who are at ease. Hear my voice, you complacent daughters. Give ear to my speech. In a little more than a year, you will shudder, you complacent women, for the grape harvest fails, the fruit harvest will not come. Tremble, you women who are at ease. Shudder, you complacent ones. Strip and make yourselves bare, and tie sackcloth around your waist. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. And the effect of righteousness will be peace, and the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places. It's pretty fiery. This is only part of it too. I'd really encourage you to read through the whole chapter, but I just felt so compelled to share this. I love Elisa's lesson this last year. She talked about, going through the storms of life and how being a Christian doesn't mean we don't go through storms, but it means that we, can stand on the rock through those storms. Whereas non-Christians, they don't have a rock to stand on. Without God, there's no hope in the desert. And I want to go back to this point here, Isaiah 32. I think that these deserts, they give us compassion for the hurting when we go through challenging times ourselves. Like I said, it doesn't mean we don't go through storms being disciples. We do, but we have hope. And it reminds us and gives us compassion for those who are without a shepherd, who are harassed and helpless. They remind us what it felt like before we had a shepherd guiding us along the right path. That makes me shudder thinking about how I used to walk before I was a Christian, the hopelessness I felt in challenging times. And I hear from women now who study the Bible. These words here in Isaiah 32, the at ease, the rise up, you women who are at ease, it's very similar to these words at the end, the secure dwelling, and the complacent daughters. It's very similar to the words of the peaceful habitation at their roots. And so I want to compare and contrast, because they're obviously very different, what he means here. He's warning them of the first word, and then he's saying, we will abide in these places at the end. So in contrast here, what it means to be secure versus to be at ease. To be secure is to be in a state of trust, of confidence, of refuge and security. I think about, someone who is a soldier whose weapons are drawn, but their heart is confident. There's a state of trust in their mind, but their weapons are drawn. They're ready for battle. Versus to be at ease, it says to be secure, but in a bad sense. To be haughty or careless, arrogant or proud. Free from misfortune. An example of this to me in my mind is a soldier whose weapons are not drawn. They're down at his side. They're not ready to go into battle. They're at ease soldier. They're very different words. And then to compare and contrast peaceful versus complacent. To be peaceful is that word shalom, which many of us know, a state of completeness, soundness, welfare, safety, health, or tranquility. It connotates peace in relationship with one another and with God. Versus to be complacent is to be marked by self-satisfaction, especially when accompanied by an unawareness of actual dangers or deficiencies. Some of the synonyms for that, I'm a words person, so bear with me as I go through the words if they're not. But some of the synonyms for complacent here are apathetic, casual, disinterested, incurious, indifferent, or nonchalant. There's also an inclination to please or to oblige, and also known as unconcerned. That word stood out to me a lot, what it really means to be complacent. I think there's an important difference between these words, but it's a very perfect holy tension, because we want to be peaceful without becoming complacent. We want to be secure without being at ease. I want to dwell in the peaceful habitation every day, in shalom every day, to have a soundness of mind and a safety of heart, no matter the circumstances of my life around me. And so, I just want us to ask ourselves today to consider, back to that word, consider. Am I living in a place of peace or a state of complacency? Am I living in a place of peace or a state of complacency? Am I concerned about the things that God is concerned about? Am I concerned about the things that God is concerned about? And is my heart truly at peace? Or have I maybe grown apathetic, even towards the lost? Apathetic towards the lost, unconcerned about the people around me, the hurting neighbors to my left and right. I found that very convicting. It's very easy for me to grow apathetic and unconcerned and just focus on my life and my family and my needs rather than the real lostness of the world. And I love how he talks here. He says, verse 17, the effect of righteousness, I believe we all want to be righteous, right? Is peace, will be peace. And the result of righteousness, quietness, and trust forever. That's what I want. I want to live in a place of a secure dwelling, a quiet resting place, to be at peace, to have trust forever. Because I know what it's like to live in turmoil. I want to have learned, I have learned to strive every single day, though, to be a woman who's at peace in my heart because I trust God, regardless of my circumstances. I mentioned dealing with anxiety and panic attacks for about a year and a half. I know what that feels like to live in turmoil, and it's miserable. And I think that those spiritual deserts, they refine us and they teach us to be righteous women, women whose hearts are not complacent towards others around us. So I want to share a little bit, just to close it out, about my renewed perspective on 2021. Rather than it being just a desert and just a very deeply challenging time, I wanted to share some victories that I realized God showed me as I reflected back about how God is good, even in the deserts. In our church, we saw 3 people baptized into Christ last year. We're a small group. That was incredible. We had 2 single brothers who are such sweethearts move here. We found a beautiful new location at half the price of our last one. And if you visited us last year, you know what a victory this is for us. And many of you have. We really needed a new spot. I'll leave it at that, but you know. So grateful for that as a church. A lot of victory there. You know, in our family, we got pregnant again. Our daughter, she turned 1 in April. She took her first steps and said her first words. And we celebrated our 5-year wedding anniversary this summer. You know, for myself, I no longer struggle with daily anxiety and have not had a panic attack in over 6 months. It's incredible. I am healthier than I've been in a long time in a lot of ways, and have experienced more joy and intimacy with God than ever before. It was so encouraging to reflect back on that, on yes, it was a deeply challenging time, but look at the good that God brought from that time, and the intimacy that he built in my relationship with him and around me, the victories. So I have a few practicals for deserts. The first one is to seek shelter, to seek a deeper intimacy with God than ever before. If you're walking through a desert, make it your aim to have a closer walk with God than ever before. And I do this by picking a verse, memorizing it, internalizing it, and walking it. For me last year, that was Romans 12:9. It says, cling to what is good. It felt like everything around me sucked. Like everything sucked. And it was so easy to complain about all the challenging things. But I decided, no, I'm going to cling to what is good. Even if what is good feels so small and minuscule today, that's what I'm going to cling to. I'm going to live this out. My second practical is to look for broom trees. Desert trees is a really interesting study. I'd really encourage you to do that. It's so fascinating to me. But a broom tree is a desert tree that provides many things, but particularly a bit of shade and respite for travelers. You know, it's said to be the good tree, the blessed tree that's in Jeremiah 17. I love the contrast of that tree when he says, you know, the cursed tree is the one who does not see good when it comes. That's what it means to be cursed. You cannot even see good when it comes, versus the blessed tree that says it has no worries, even in a year of drought. I want to be that. It may be a year of drought, but I've got no worries. I am in a state of shalom. And I think we do this practically by always looking for the daily provisions of God, whether big or small. I would keep a list in my planner at the beginning of the month, and I literally called it my broom trees from the month. And I'd write down big or small, any good thing that happened so that I could cling to that and reflect on all the good instead of the challenges. And then my last practical is to become a shelter. Romans 12:9 says, to be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. I think that we need to be an example of someone who perseveres no matter what and continues to celebrate life as we do that, who celebrates life. Life is worth celebrating here on earth, even birthdays, holidays, small things, big things. Celebrate life and continue to persevere through your deserts. That's how we're an example to the women around us in our lives, and to the lost, the hurting, that we can celebrate, we can rejoice and be faithful in prayer and rejoiceful in hope. So that's what I've got for us. Thanks so much. Went a little bit longer than I was expecting, but yeah, I hope that was encouraging to you guys. If you're walking through a desert season, even now, that you feel a little bit less alone and a little bit closer with God, and a little bit of hope that he's doing something good and beautiful in your life. So that's what I've got for us.